So we are back, guys. Thank you so much again for helping us make this campaign awesome. We have unlocked the Ovoid strategy video, which is what this is going to be.
Obviously, probably the most important strategy video yet, right? So the Ovoid is the card that you need to win the game in Chaosmos. Arguably the only card that you really care about at the end of the game.
Yeah, so basically, you need to have this in your hand when the chaos clock reaches 0. But all it does throughout the game, if you keep it in your hand, is fill up one of your precious hand slots. So the question is, what do you do when you start with the Ovoid, or you find it immediately at the beginning of the game?
Right. So starting with the Ovoid, you might think, oh, this is amazing, I've already won, I've got the Ovoid in my hand. The other thing you might be thinking is there's 48 turns left, and I have the Ovoid right now, and I still have to have it 48 turns from now. So having the Ovoid early can be great because you can control kind of where it's going to be and you have that immediate knowledge, but it can also be a liability because you've got to figure out a way to keep everybody else from figuring out where the Ovoid is for the entire game.
Right. It's almost impossible to do that. One thing I like to do is I sort of decide, based on who I'm playing with, which of these players or which of these aliens can I afford to allow them to gain this knowledge? For example, if I decide to hide the Ovoid on a vault, that vault is going to become public knowledge, and maybe that alien near that area is going to find out about it, and maybe I can afford for that alien to find out because I know that that person doesn't have a key, for example. So he'll know that the Ovoid is in that vault, but he won't be able to access it. So
yeah, another important thing when you start with the Ovoid is figuring out where you want to leave it. And so obviously you can leave it on somebody's toxic planet, which prevents that alien from finding it, but also most aliens are kind of attuned to that. If you go to their toxic planet, they might be like, oh, well, I've got to make sure to go figure out what's there. Another thing you can do, which is often really effective, is as soon as somebody else goes to a planet and leaves it, if you come in and you open it and it's like, oh, sucks, somebody else already looted it, if you slip the Ovoid in there and then put that planet back, well, a lot of times it'll go unnoticed for a long part of the game, and that's a good way to keep the Ovoid hidden.
Right. Now, of course, you could keep it in your hand, which is another thing you could do, but unless you're very combat oriented, you're going to lose it at some point, because a lot of combat is keeping single-use cards that are powerful, and then of course once you've expended them to win your first few combats, now of course you're weaker. So you might keep it in your hand until you start to get weaker in combat, but eventually you're going to say, okay, somebody is starting to subvert my combat strategy, I've got to get rid of it now.
Right.
And it's so frequent that I've got it in my hand, and just when I drop it off on a planet, someone comes in like the next turn or 2 turns later and attacks me and finds out, oh, he doesn't have it. And now I'm like, okay, now I'm weak, but at least I still know where the Ovoid is.
Right, and there's also always the danger that somebody will see from scrying what you have. And so if you do want to carry the Ovoid in your hand for some reason, it's great to be able to pick up the Signal Jammer, which blocks people from looking in your hand.
Or the Cloaking Orb is also good.
Right, the Cloaking Orb hides one card in your hand when somebody looks at your hand. So that's another good way to protect the Ovoid if you have it, or if you put it somewhere but you want to make people think that you have it.
Right, so constantly someone will scry my hand, find out I have the Ovoid, and I'm like, okay, the most important thing right now, beyond collecting more spores and imps and weapons and planetary transceivers, I've got to create a fog. Right now, I've got to make that player unsure whether I still have it in my hand or not, because he might spend several turns looking for it again. If I land on Pendra, did I leave it on Pendra? Is it still in my hand? If I land on Pendra and then hypertube some anonymous card to Jagladak, now I could have hypertubed the Ovoid away, I might still have it in my hand, or it might be on Pendra. You are creating this fog of war, which is going to allow you more strategic options, and it throws your opponents sort of into chaos.
Right, because as people discover different things, they're basically closing off doors. They're closing options of where the Ovoid could be. Every time they explore a new planet, they figure out it's not there, it's not there. And if they do that too much and you don't change up your strategy, eventually they'll eliminate all the possibilities and they'll figure out that it's in your hand or that it's on Ob or something like that. So a really big important thing, like Joey mentioned, was the fog of war, and continually shifting things around so that players can't be sure where you've left something.
Right. If you're Drusu and you have the scrying power, you can peek onto planets or look in other players' hands, and you have the Ovoid to start, and you don't do any scrying, they are going to pretty quickly assume that you've got it because you have reduced that fog for them. Because if you are not acting the way Drusu would act if Drusu didn't know what was going on. So you might, even if you know where the ovoid is, you might basically try to use some psychological warfare. Right. And another big thing we haven't talked about, of course, is what if you don't start with the ovoid?
Right.
Well, how do you deduce where it is in the first place?
And that's where, again, paying attention to other people is really important because everybody will try to be bluffing, obviously, if they have the ovoid, but you can usually get a sense, if somebody suddenly jumps back to a planet that they just went to,
that's
or if they run back home, or if you came and attacked their base and didn't beat it and then they rush right to it, you pay attention to what value people place, your opponents place on different locations on the game board, and you can use that to your advantage to kind of decipher where something might be, especially the ovoid.
And of course, landing flags as well are important. When you land on a planet, of course, you're going to leave your flag indicating that you've most recently been to that planet. Now, other players can sort of deduce not just where you've been, but where you're going, and they can say, okay, I scried onto Guriwan. So I know that the ovoid was on Guriwan, 12 turns ago. But then Matt landed there, and then he announced that there was a vault, and so I know that there's a vault there, and then someone else went there, so it could still be in the vault on Guriwan. Matt might have it in his hand, or the person with the key might have unlocked the vault, so now there's 3 different places. But now they're all landing on other planets, and the fog is starting to build and build and build, so now you've got to do something immediately. You've got to basically reduce the fog. You've got to attack Matt. You've got to scry the other guy and look in his hand. Okay, now I know for sure it's still on Guriwan because you used deduction.
Right, yeah. It's all about eliminating those options by closing those doors so that you can be sure it's either in Matt's hand or he left it on Dismer. And then once you can narrow things down, then you've got a much better chance of figuring out where the ovoid is.
Right, and this whole time while you're doing this, of course, you've only got those limited hand slots, and you have to decide. Okay, Matt's got in his hand, he's very combat oriented. I have to get a powerful combat strategy going right now. But then, if someone steals something from Matt and it's 7 or 8 turns from the end, you're thinking to yourself, okay, no one's going to leave it in Matt's hand this close to the end. I probably don't need a combat strategy because the guy whose special power involves vaults has it now. I need to get that key in my hand, so in case he's going to put it in a vault. You constantly are paying attention, adapting your strategy. Even if you have an amazing hand, maybe it's time to drop that hand off and just pick up something else that you think is more appropriate, because the ovoid is all that matters. It doesn't matter about having, I have 3 spores and I have all the imps and imp food. What matters only is this card in your hand on that final turn. And hopefully you get that temporal displacer too, so you can surprise people for the win.
Exactly. Okay, so that's the ovoid strategy.
Thanks a lot.